Hello, my name is Emma, and in today's video, I am going to teach you something very useful, and that is how to talk about age, or how to talk about how old someone is. So we're going to look at words like early, mid, late, and how we can add these to people's ages. We're going to talk about the word ish and age, and we're also going to talk about the word something when it refers to age. So imagine this situation. You see someone and someone says, "Oh, how old is your teacher?" Or "How old is your boss? How old is that lady at the store?" And you look at the person and you think, I don't really know. I don't know how old this lady is. Maybe around 50 years old? Maybe 55? I don't know. So when you kind of know the age, but you're not exactly sure, that's when we use a lot of these types of words. And I'll explain how to use them in a moment. But first, let's look at some common mistakes people make when they talk about age. I have here 4 sentences. One of these sentences is correct. I want you to try to figure out which are correct sentences and which ones are not correct. Well, the first sentence I hear many students say, "She has 50 years," or "She has 50 years old." What's the problem here? The problem is the verb. When we're talking about age, we do not use have in English. We use have in other languages, but in English, we use our be verb. So we can say, I am, you are, he is, she is, we are, they are. And then we have the number. So let's look at an example of that. So this looks a little bit better. We see she is. That's good. They have the right verb. She is 50 years. Is that correct? It's not correct because there is a word missing. And that word is old. In English, we say she is 50 years old. He is 20 years old. So we need the word old here, and it's missing. So this one's incorrect as well. So I'm just going to put an X and an X. What about this one? She is 50 years old. Is that correct? Yeah. That's a great sentence. She is 50 years old. Beautiful. And what about the last one? She is 50 years old, and we have some hyphens here. So this is something that's very confusing, even to English speakers who are native English speakers. So this sentence is incorrect because of the hyphens, but I'll explain when we use hyphens a little later on in this lesson. So this is incorrect. All right, so now let's get started and find out more about age. So there are many times when we don't know a person's exact age. So what can we say about a person when we don't know their age? Well, there's many different options in English. When we don't know the exact age of a person, one thing we can do is if we know the decade they are in, we can use that. So for example, if I think somebody is between 30 and 39 years old, I don't know if they're 30, I don't know if they're 35, they look between 30 and 39, I can say, oh, the woman, she is in her 30s. And notice this has an S on it. She is in her 30s. This means she is somewhere between 30 and 39, but I don't know exactly what her age is. We can use this with all the decades. We can say, he is in his 20s. He is in his 40s. She is in her 50s. They are in their 60s. I am in my 70s. He is in his 80s. We are in our 90s. And if you're talking about teenagers, You can also use this too. They are in their teens. So for somebody who is 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, or 19, you can say they are in their teens. Okay, so what about if I want to talk about myself? I know my age. We usually use this for people when we don't know their ages, but I know how old I am. Would I use something like this? Yes, I would. And the reason is maybe I don't want you to know my age. So a lot of people, especially women, they like to keep their age a secret. So one way to keep your age a secret is you could always just give the decade. So I could say, oh, I'm in my 20s or I'm in my 30s. You take a guess. Which one is it? Or I'm in my teens. Clearly not, but this is what you could say. I am in my 30s. It's a way to avoid giving your specific age. Okay, what's another way we can talk about age if we don't know someone's age? Well, we can use the word something. Something. How old is she? She is 30-something. He's 40-something. If you want, you can also have years old. He's 30-something years old. She's 40-something years old, or she's 40-something. Both are possible. So something means you know that they're somewhere between 30 and 39, but you don't know exactly the age. What about, can I say this about myself? Can I say, I'm a 30-something year old. This sounds very uncommon. I probably would not use it to talk about myself, but I use it to talk about other people. So what's another way to say, to talk about somebody's age when you don't know their age exactly? Well, we can use the ending ish. So ish can be added to a number in order to mean around or about or approximately. You're not exactly sure, but it's around. So for example, I think this woman is 70. I can say, she's 70-ish. Maybe she's 69, maybe she's 71 or 72. She's around 70. So the woman is 70-ish. Let's look at another example. There's a teenager. I think he's 18, maybe 19. I can say he is 18-ish. So that means around. And again, it shows I'm not exactly sure. We tend to use ish, not really in writing. We use it in conversation. So this is better to use when you are speaking. I would not recommend to write this. All right, so now let's look at some other examples of how to talk about age. Sometimes we think we know how old someone is around. So maybe we think that they are between 30 and 33, or maybe between 34 and 36, or maybe 37 to 39. What we can use for these situations is the words early, mid, and late. We use early when it's the early part of a person's decade. So if they're 40, 41, 42, that's the early part of the 40s. We use mid when it's in the middle. So maybe 44, 45, 46. That's the middle of the 40 decade. And then if we're talking about the end of it, we might say 47, 48, and 49. That's the late part of a person's 40th decade. So let's look at some examples of this. If I say I am in my early 30s, this means my age is between 30 and 33. I'm not being exact, but I might say something like this. If I introduce myself, I might say, oh, I'm in my early 30s. So between 30 and 33. And notice the structure of this. We have the preposition here in. We have a word such as my, your, his, her, their. And then we have the descriptor word, early, mid, or late. And then we have our age with an S. So I am in my early 30s. I am in my mid 30s. So this means between 34 and 36 years old. Now, I notice there's a space here, so I'm going to make a quick correction. And I am going to add a hyphen. So for mid, we need a hyphen. For early and late, we don't use a hyphen here. I am in my mid-30s, 34 to 36. What about late? We can say I am in my late 30s, and that refers to ages 37 to 39. All right, so I'm going to give some other examples of this now. Let's play a game. I'm going to say an age, and you tell me if it's early, mid, or late. Catherine is 34. So you might say Catherine is in her mid-30s, and you would be correct. Amy is 91. Amy is in her early 90s. What about Marge? Marge is 29. You can say Marge is in her late 20s. So this is really useful. One thing you can do with this is you can think about yourself. What age are you? Are you in your early, mid, or late? And then you write the decade. So try to make sentences. You can say, I am in my late 60s. I am in my early teens. Whatever the case may be, you can make a sentence using this. You can also try to think about people in your life. Think about your family and your friends. And try to make some sentences using this structure. So he is in his, and then you have the age, or she is in her. So use that structure and try to make some sentences using this. So the question that we want to find out the answer to hyphenate or not to hyphenate. So first of all, what is a hyphen? Well, a hyphen is this. It's a small line that connects two words. So when it comes to age, sometimes we hyphenate and sometimes we don't. So let me tell you when we don't hyphenate and when we do hyphenate. So if the age you write comes after the noun it describes, you don't hyphenate. So that sounds really confusing. Let's look at an example to help us understand this better. My mother turned 66 years old. So mother is the noun. What describes her? Well, the age. So 66 years old is describing my mother. My mother is the noun. So we know that mother is the noun, and because mother or the age comes after our noun mother, there's no hyphens. So there's no line between 66 and years, and there's no line between years and old. What about when we do the opposite? Well, if age describes and is also before the noun, then we do hyphenate. So this might sound confusing. Let's look at an example with mother again. In this case, notice my 66 hyphen year hyphen old mother is nice. So we have the same noun, which is mother, but in this case, the age comes before the word mother. So because it comes before, we hyphenate it. There's another example of when we hyphenate ages, and that's when an age is a noun. So remember, nouns can have articles in front of them, like the or sometimes a. In this case, if age is a noun, For example, a 35-year-old is at the store. In this case, age is a noun. We're talking about a specific person who's 35. We hyphenate 35-year-old. And notice there's no S with year, 35-year-old. That's how we know it's also a noun. Okay, so let's practice what we learned. I don't know how old Queen Elizabeth is. I don't know how old Michael Jordan is. And I don't know I don't know how old Ed Sheeran is. I know Queen Elizabeth is 90-something, Michael Jordan is 60-something, and Ed Sheeran is 30-something years old. So let's try to use the word early, mid, and late with these examples. I've made up the ages. I'm not exactly sure, but let's use these ages and use the words early, mid, and late with them. So Queen Elizabeth is 96 years old. This means she is in her, so 96, is it early, mid, or late? This means she is in her mid-90s. So I'm just going to write the word mid and hyphenate it. Michael Jordan is 60 years old. This means he is in his, so 60, is this early, mid, or late? This means it's early. We can say he is in his early 60s. And finally, Ed Sheeran. Ed Sheeran is 34 years old. He is in his, so 34. Do you think it's in the early, mid, or late? This would be mid. Again, he is in his mid-30s. If he were 37, he would be in his late 30s. All right, so thank you for watching and for learning about age with me. There was a lot of material and content in this video. I recommend you practice this by visiting our website at www.engvid.com. There you can take a quiz to practice what you learned today. And remember, practice makes perfect. By taking our quizzes, you can really help remember what you learned. I also recommend you check out my YouTube channel and subscribe. I have many different videos on all sorts of different topics related to English. So thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care.